Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's Monday, July the 3rd, 2023. It's a minute or two after 11 a.m. And I think I've got an interesting show lined up for you here because I've been following Mark Kulak's work on the Flight 93 and in particular the anthrax aspect of it. And I recalled a book that I have. Um, Sad to hear. I'm sorry. I'm kind of shocked at the comment here. White Rose says, so sad to hear about Mark, but I'm happy he's getting more family time. I'm not quite sure what that means. Does that mean Mark has made some announcement I'm not aware of? Perhaps somebody would share that with me in the comments because this show really is kind of for Mark. And I wanted to emphasize, from the constitutional point of view, what I think I see is going on here and has been from, you know, probably for all of our lives, but in various ways came to a surface in November of 2001, 2001. I'm sorry, September 11th, 2001. And let's see. Oh, he announces a semi-retirement. Well, good for him. Good for him. He's been working very, very hard. Very hard. So anyway, let's do this without further ado, and just as a bit of background to feather into the work that Mark and others have been doing on the anthrax attack of September 2001 and thereafter, called Amerithrax by the press, and I guess that's what we'll have to call it. Well, let's go to the reading I wanted to get to. It's from this book, the 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy by Graeme MacQueen. And here is the book that you can see the cover. And I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 3 because I think what Mark has been trying to point out to everybody is that the Constitution was under attack as much as the people were under attack. And the question of whether the Constitution has survived or not, well, from my point of view, the Constitution was overthrown by the assassination of President Kennedy in November 22nd, 1963. What's that, 60 years ago? But that it still stands in the sense that it is the foundation and it is the framework of our government. So I don't think that it's beyond hope. Nevertheless, the people that are occupying the positions of power created by our Constitution are, in fact, participants in the coup and have been ever since then, unless they distance themselves in some way. But it appears that most people have been able to adjust their inner sensibilities in such a way as to say, well, you know what? It doesn't matter what the lies were back then. America still stands. We're still the same people. We're not going to worry about the legalities of whether Alan Dulles did or did not break the Constitution when President Kennedy was assassinated. We don't really ever think we'll ever know the answer. And by the way, thank you very much, President Biden, for sneakily on Friday night after the news cycle telling us, no, you still can't have all the files from the JFK assassination. No, you can't have them. The American people, you can't handle the truth. Huh. It's not us that can't handle the truth, Joe. It's you. Well, since I had started looking at the chat room, I'm going to look back and say, let's see. Deborah Johnson. Hi, Deborah. Mark says he would not be posting anything for a while. Okay. Well, look, we've got a ton of his work to work through. And we have not absorbed a tenth of it yet. So let's get back, reread, rewatch, and absorb. Do some transcripts. Create a Substack for him and do transcripts of his shows. There's a lot of ways we can continue to make use of, support, and spread the word about his great work. Just great work, Mark Kulak at Housatonic Live. Okay. And hello, Kevin Timmer. Good to have you here. And everybody else, Christy, and all the rest of you. And, if you're watching on Facebook, thank you very much and spread the word that we are live on Facebook. Every show is live on Facebook. And thank you, Facebook, for not striking a single one of my shows since we started broadcasting on McDuff Lives channel on Facebook. Well, I really want you to join my Rumble because one day I'm going to say goodbye to YouTube. I am threatening to do it. And one day I will. I'm hoping to get 1,000 followers on my Rumble channel. And remember, there's a little bit of confusion there. You have to go to the one that's all one word. It's called McDuff Lives, all one word, as opposed to the other one, which will not give you the live shows. Okay, so this is a book by Graeme MacQueen, The Case for Domestic Conspiracy, the 2001 Anthrax Deception. And I'm going to go to chapter 3. You know the background pretty much already. War and Civil Liberties. The anthrax attacks occurred at a crucial moment in U.S. history. The attacks had to vie for space in the newspapers with several other important events. As October of 2001 progressed and more anthrax cases became known, the legislation that would eventually be called the USA Patriot Act, and here's the quote, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism, unquote, act, was being hurried through Congress. They should have made the name shorter. It was signed into law by George W. Bush on October 26th of 2001. Yeah, Toto didn't like that either. During the same month, Bush gave his approval to the first bulk domestic spying by the NSA, National Security Agency, Fort Meade. But in the fall of 2001, war overshadowed all else and enabled other transformations. The first U.S. military strike on Afghanistan took place 2 days after the first anthrax victim, Robert Stevens, died of inhalation anthrax in Florida. As the anthrax attacks developed, so did the invasion of Afghanistan, and in the background, preparations were underway for the invasion of Iraq. Right? They're already preparing to invade Iraq. It is important to reflect on the relationship between war and civil liberties and on the steps that were taken in 2001 to ensure that a state of war was recognized so that the administration's goals could be achieved. Without understanding the role of war and the nature of the domestic preparations required to conduct it, we will not be in a position to understand the 2001 anthrax attacks. War's influence on civil liberties. War leaders, especially in recent history, have typically sought to achieve a high degree of social unity and public confidence in the executive during wartime. When mobilization begins, the leadership seeks to ensure that there is no loss of energy or purpose, no doubt about the rectitude of the direction in which society is heading, no holding back from sacrifice. The entire social body is to cooperate. Although attempts to get the support of the general population have certainly been found in ancient times, the tendency to seek passionate enthusiastic engagement during war became more common with the spread of republican forms of government and the replacement of professional armies with citizen armies. The desired unity and confidence in leadership can be at times a spontaneous development, but at other times propaganda has been necessary to help achieve the required, quote, confidence in one's own cause and one's leaders, unquote. Oh my, how many shows have we spent on propaganda? The social unity common in war does more than facilitate the use of force against an external enemy. It also reduces the space for dissent and therefore the space for civil liberties in the domestic population. As David Dodge put it, reflecting on what he saw around him in the U.S. during the War of 1812, quote, to inflame a mild republic with the spirit of war is putting all its liberties to the utmost hazard, unquote. 100 years after Dodge, in a famous essay generally known as, quote, War is the Health of the State, unquote, Randolph Bourne recorded the process of mobilization in the U.S. as the nation joined World War I. He noted that, quote, it is precisely in war that the urgency for union seems greatest. And he observed that once an executive has made the decision to go to war, the entire domestic population will commonly adopt the decision, even if it was given little or no role in the process. Quote, the moment war is declared, the mass of the people, through some spiritual alchemy, become convinced that they have willed and executed the deed themselves. Unquote. The people, said Bourne, quote, with the exception of a few malcontents, proceed to allow themselves to be regimented, coerced, deranged in all the environments of their lives, and turned into a solid manufactory of destruction. War, quote, automatically sets in motion throughout society those irresistible forces for uniformity, for passionate cooperation with the government in coercing into obedience the minority groups and individuals which lack the larger herd sense, unquote. Where the executive sees insufficient uniformity, it may simply crush dissent. Republics, Bourne claimed, can in times of war be difficult to distinguish from autocracies. In short, during wartime, the very liberties democracies claim to be fighting to protect are reduced. Whether these liberties will be regained depends on several factors, including the degree of persistence of a perceived external threat. References to the global war on terror as the Long War, possibly lasting for generations, have naturally caused great concern among those who care about U.S. civil liberties. And for the record, this book was published in 2014. Pardon me. So, so far, just my comments are I think this essay is dead on. And it's something we need to recognize that this, what he calls alchemy, is part of our human heritage. That there comes a time when you have to pick a leader and you have to follow that leader, or you and your family and everybody that you know is going to get killed. That's ancient warfare going back as far as you care to go. And usually there has been some preparation by that community as what to do in case, the orcs come over the hill. What are you going to do? Well, like one of the societies I've studied is the Celtic Society, and more specifically the Irish Celtic Society. And you look at the clan or the tuath or the fine or these are different words for different sizes of the group, but think of it as a clan, and it could be a few hundred people or tens of thousands of people. But the government is a civil government in which there is a appointed war leader who really doesn't have anything to do unless there's war. But when there's war, then everybody falls under him, and he is the absolute leader of the whole clan, you know? So the idea of it being in our genes, from just thousands of years of repetition, that when the leader says we're going to war, most people, didn't follow the politics that got us there. They're just like, wow, okay, we got to go to war. Where's my shield? Where's my sword? Let's get dressed and go join the regiment without thinking about it, because that's just what you do. And now the idea of a republic, the idea of the United States as a republic of citizens and Minutemen, with that brown vest in the closet, ready for you to go rush out to join up with the militia, is not the same as the ancient uh, duties of service to the Lord, and it's not the same as the ancient Celtic tradition. What it is a legally binding assumption that you, as a free person, are going to want to defend your republic, defend your constitution. And so when it comes under attack, you're going to join that militia because that's who you are. That's what you want to do. But the duties of citizenship require that you do study the politics, that you do find, who's right and who's wrong in sorting out, do we need to go to war or not? And then along comes these um, so-called, self-appointed leaders that seem to think that they know where we need to go, and they're going to use the military to do it. But the only thing that's keeping them back is the Constitution, which says, no, it's only Congress that can declare war. You can't get the president to unleash the army against anybody without the Congress declaring war. It just can't be done legally. Well, what have we seen but a attempt after attempt at circumventing that and making the people follow their instincts to follow the great leader who says, hey, we're going to war, and the people are supposed to just follow along. And if you don't, then sure, your YouTube channel is going to get taken down. Sure, you're not going to be featured on the news. And sure, you're going to get shadow banned on Twitter because they don't want your voice. They only want the narrative that supports the war, even if it's a lie, even if it's pure propaganda, because that leader has decided we got to go to war and we need our people to sit down, shut up, and do what they're told. Or else we're going to lose the war, and we're not going to lose the war because we are, you know, us. We are us. So, when the executive sees insufficient uniformity, it may simply crush dissent. The case of 9/11. The Constitution of the United States explicitly gives to Congress the power to declare war, but the Constitution also says that the President will be Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces during war. What was intended as a check and balance measure became a recipe for struggle. When taking on the role of commander-in-chief, presidents may demand certain powers for decision making and for deploying institutions arguably connected to war making that they normally do not have. Once a war is in motion, presidents keen on expanding their power can take advantage of the powers war grants them and subsequent presidents can cite these occasions as precedents for seizing further power. In the case of 9/11, effort was expended from the very outset to define the day's attacks as an act of war rather than simply an incident of terrorism. If the public were convinced that an act of war had taken place, if a condition of war was established, then it would seem natural for the U.S. government to respond within that framework. In that case, and especially if Congress gave some sign of approval, the president could arguably assume his role as commander in chief and as embodiment of the executive branch of government, take whatever extraordinary powers he could assert were required. He could take whatever powers he could assert are, quote, required, unquote. During the day of September 11th, as the television cameras rolled, one well-known personage after another proclaimed that the United States had been subjected to an act of war. On CNN, the list included John McCain, Kurt Weldon, Samuel Berger, George Shultz, Shimon Peres, Lawrence Eagleburger, Orrin Hatch, James Woolsey, Dianne Feinstein, and John Kerry. Yet, when CNN anchor Judy Woodruff challenged Senator John McCain to justify the claim, the best he could do was repeat his assertion. Little wonder it was not at all necessary to define the events as an act of war. Indeed, in light of the fact that no state seemed to have carried out the attacks, it was downright peculiar to call it an act of war, just as it was peculiar for the U.S. to consider carrying out an act of war in response. It would have been more natural to call the 9/11 events crimes and turn to either domestic U.S. law or international law for an appropriate response. The Taliban, who formed the de facto government in Afghanistan, indicated they would be willing to cooperate in a legal proceeding. When Osama bin Laden was accused of the deed by the U.S. government, they offered at various times to hand him over for trial if the U.S. would simply supply evidence, some evidence of his guilt. From the perspective of law, this was an entirely reasonable request. No credible evidence had been presented. Bin Laden had not been formally charged with the crime by the FBI, nor for that matter would he ever be charged for the crime of 9/11. But on September 12th, Bush publicly defined the 9/11 acts as acts of war. Quote, the deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war, unquote. The Bush administration had by this time already decided that war, not law, would be the framework used to deal with 9/11. Bush did not even acknowledge that the Taliban request for evidence as it was. Instead, operating entirely within the discourse of war, he referred to Taliban requests as pleas for negotiation, which he then declined. Secretary of State Colin Powell stated that the U.S. would soon be presenting, for the edification of the world, a document detailing evidence of bin Laden's guilt. When no such document was produced, the government of the United Kingdom stepped forward. The British document of October 4th was, however, astonishingly weak. The preamble noted that, quote, this document does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law, even as it was purporting to provide something of much greater import, a casus belli. Indeed, the document consisted mainly of unverifiable claims from intelligence agencies, the evidence seldom rising to the level of circumstantial. Anthony Scrivener, QC, noted in the Times that, quote, it is a sobering thought that better evidence is required to prosecute a shoplifter than is needed to commence a world war, unquote. A familiar band of conservatives and neoconservatives rapidly made the point that since the attacks were an act of war, the U.S. must wage war in response. Henry Kissinger was among the first to make the point in writing. At about 9 p.m. on September 11th, his article was posted online at the Washington Post site, and it showed up in print on September 12th. Evoking Pearl Harbor, Kissinger made it clear that treating the attacks as a police matter was not good enough. The U.S. response must end, quote, the way that the attack on Pearl Harbor ended, with the destruction of the system that is responsible for it, unquote. The U.S., Kissinger explained, should not confine its wrath to states connected through evidence to the 9/11 attacks. Quote, any government that shelters groups capable of this kind of attack, whether or not they can be shown to have been involved in this attack, must pay an exorbitant price, unquote. On September 12th, others, almost as quick with their pens as Kissinger, joined the chorus. Robert Kagan, one of the founders of the neoconservative Project for the New American Century, began his article with another evocation of Pearl Harbor. Quote, September 11th, 2001, the date that will live in infamy, unquote. And then said that Americans must respond as did their grandfathers. Quote, not by engaging in an extended legal effort to arraign, try, and convict killers as if they were criminals and not warriors, but by doing the only thing we now can do, go to war with those who have launched this awful war against us, unquote. He continued, please let us make no mistake this time. We are at war now. We have suffered the first devastating strike, and he urged the Congress immediately declare war. Neoconservative Charles Krauthammer was equally outspoken. This is not crime, he began his article. This is war. He criticized Colin Powell for pledging to bring those responsible to justice. You do not bring such people to justice, he said. You bring criminals to justice. You rain destruction on combatants. These suggestions may seem rather bold given the lack of evidence identifying a perpetrator, but Krauthammer claimed to know who the enemy was. Quote, our delicate sensibilities have prevented us from pronouncing its name. Its name is radical Islam. Unquote. After a few speculative comments about his chosen perpetrator, Krauthammer moved on to state sponsors. Quote, and then there are the governments, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya among them. Which one was responsible? We will find out soon enough. Whatever state sponsor was unmasked, said Krauthammer, it too must be included in the U.S. war plan. Quote, any country that harbors and protects him, bin Laden, is our enemy. We must carry the war to them. He finished his exercise by making the same point as Kagan. Quote, we should seriously consider a congressional declaration of war, unquote. Daniel Pipes, in the Wall Street Journal, September 12th, noted that among the U.S. government failures that had permitted the attacks of the previous day, foremost had been, quote, seeing terrorism as a crime, unquote. The better approach, he claimed, is to see terrorism as a form of warfare and to target not just those foot soldiers who actually carry out the violence, but the organizations and governments that stand behind them, unquote. On the same day, and also in the Wall Street Journal, Mark Halperin excitedly pondered the past aggressors who had stirred America's ferocity, paying for it with a Berlin that we had reduced to rubble and a Tokyo we had reduced to rubble. He confidently named the chief suspects of 9/11 attacks, bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat, and concluded, quote, let this spectacular act of terrorism be the decisive repudiation of the mistaken assumptions that conventional warfare is a thing of the past, unquote. One day later, September 13th, neoconservative academic Lauren Milroy wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, The Iraqi Connection, which, in a tangle of allegations and suggestions, furthered her project, which had begun several years previously, of laying the blame for terrorist attacks in the U.S., on Iraq. She ended by asking whether terrorism against the U.S. cannot best be approached as, quote, acts of war. with all the complexity that wartime activities regularly involve? Is it not odd that all these intellectuals would risk urging such extreme actions against the wrong party? They were, after all, speaking in the absence of credible evidence. What if different perpetrators were shortly to be discovered, or their identities were clarified by subsequent assaults on the U.S.? Why take the chance of losing your credibility by going after those who might very shortly turn out to be the wrong people? Were these accusers all simpletons? Or were they parties, knowingly or not, to a plan that preceded 9/11? That they may have shared a predilection for accusing Muslims, whether Muslims were complicit or not. It is not surprising that they united in calling for war as the appropriate response should give pause. The process continued on September 14th. A Washington Post article by John Lancaster and Susan Schmidt noted, quote, "Stunned by the magnitude of Tuesday's terrorist attacks, Congress and the White House are reassessing an approach to fighting terrorism that until this week has favored the tools of law enforcement over those of war," unquote. The intellectual framework for endorsing a policy of war was almost complete. On September 12th, Bush had met with congressional leaders to explain the need for a resolution that would allow him to use force. Democratic Senator Tom Daschle indicated at that meeting that he was willing to step up and propose the bill to Congress. Since he was the Senate Majority Leader, that virtually guaranteed its acceptance. He did not, however, write the text of the bill. It was forwarded to him by the White House that evening. Despite his eagerness to be of help, Daschle was taken aback by the breadth of the resolution. It was not a full-fledged declaration of war, but it gave the President of the United States extraordinary power and breadth of action. After a preamble, the text read, quote, "that the President is authorized to use all necessary means and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, harbored, committed, or aided in the planning or commission of the attacks against the United States that occurred on September 11, 2001, and to deter and preempt any related future acts of terrorism or aggression against the United States," unquote. Daschle understood that this resolution would give a blank check to go anywhere, anytime against anyone the Bush administration or any subsequent administration deemed capable of carrying out an attack. So he had the resolution modified. The final resolution, after an expanded preamble, said that the President is authorized to use all necessary means and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Daschle had managed through his revisions to restrict permission for future aggression by keeping the focus more tightly on the September 11th events. My comment is it doesn't seem like a whole lot of modification, but at least it's focused on the ones that are tied to 9/11 at any rate. But the resolution still had two profoundly important implications beyond the obvious facilitation of an attack on Afghanistan. First, the resolution arguably, and not everyone agreed in parentheses, let Bush assume the role of commander-in-chief. And that meant he would now be able to use his new special powers in ways that could have profound effects domestically. This, as we shall see, is what he immediately began to do. Second, there were crucial epistemic implications, implications having to do with knowledge and the validation of knowledge of this resolution. The resolution gave Bush the right to determine matters of fact in relation to the events of 9/11. He got to say who planned, carried out, and so forth, the 9/11 attacks. Although he could call on U.S. intelligence agencies to help him, there was no requirement that their methods meet the standards of a legal process. George Bush could have determined that the Tooth Fairy was responsible for 9/11 and still have met the conditions of this resolution. This was a fatal mistake on the part of Congress. On September 14th, the revised resolution was proposed to and approved by both chambers of Congress. Democratic Representative Barbara Lee, in later years the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, cast the sole vote in Congress against the resolution. On September 18th, Bush signed the bill into law. Pollsters immediately got to work to determine how willing the public was directly after the 9/11 assaults to support military force while surrendering civil rights. A Washington Post ABC poll was initiated on the evening of 9/11. The poll reportedly found that, quote, nearly 9 in 10 people supported taking military action against the groups or nations responsible for yesterday's attacks, even if it led to war. 2 in 3 were willing to surrender, quote, some of the liberties we have in this country, unquote, to crack down on terrorism. The next chapter of the book, or the next part of this chapter, is about the military tribunals. And well, I have time. We'll read a little bit of this. The tribunals, having induced Congress to approve the use of force, the executive kept up its momentum and, with the help of the anthrax attacks, put in place the systems that would reduce the civil liberties of everyone in the United States. And immediately after the Patriot Act and the NSA domestic spying were in place, the executive announced its intention to set up a special system of military tribunals to try people seized in the global war on terror. In November and early December, the Senate Judiciary Committee held 3 days of hearings in which the proposed military tribunals were the central focus. Patrick Leahy, chair of the committee, noted that although he had been in daily contact with the Department of Justice during the negotiations leading to the passage of the Patriot Act, no one from the DOJ had mentioned to him the setting up of military tribunals. He was concerned, and he saw it as his committee's duty to look into the matter. During the hearings, many expert witnesses challenged the executive's right to establish the tribunals, especially in view of the fact that the U.S. Constitution gives that power to Congress. Neil Catal, for example, professor at Georgetown, said that what was taking place was clearly a seizure of power. Michael Chertoff, then Assistant Attorney General, was the first witness to appear on behalf of the DOJ. We are at war, he explained. We are dealing with a power that the president is exercising that comes from his status as commander-in-chief and not as his status as head of the law enforcement function. When Attorney General Ashcroft made a reluctant, scowling appearance on the last day of the hearings, he made the same point. Quote, the Constitution vests the president with the extraordinary and sole authority as commander-in-chief to lead our nation in times of war, unquote. William Barr, former Attorney General of the United States, added his weight. Yeah, I didn't write that. The author wrote this. He had some William Barr added his weight. All right. The president, quote, the president is acting as commander in chief of our armed forces. He is exercising the war powers of the United States. Our national goal is, in this instance, is not the correction, deterrence, and rehabilitation of an errant member of the body politic. Rather, it is the destruction of foreign force that poses a risk to our national security, unquote. Any reader of the hearings transcripts will quickly understand that the assault on civil liberties in the U.S. that began subsequent to the 9/11 attacks was entirely dependent on the claim that the country was at war. The separate ideas customarily contained in this claim were the attacks on New York and Washington were acts of war. The U.S. was, from the moment of those attacks, in a de facto state of war, which it could not avoid. The September 14th resolution on the use of force by Congress recognized these facts and gave the congressional approval that allowed the president to become commander in chief. Every one of these separate claims can be disputed, but the fact remains that the notion that the U.S. was at war and that it had come to this condition justly and as a victim was central to the U.S. government's initiatives, both internal and external, in the fall of 2001. War leaders want social unity. They want everyone to get behind them. If telling the population the truth helps achieve social unity under the command of the executive, then the truth will be told. And if it has the opposite effect, as it will in many cases, it will frequently be avoided, hidden, or distorted. Choosing the war system rather than the legal system has therefore grave implications. If law is chosen, official prosecutors will be obligated to provide evidence and to provide a chain of reasoning that connects the evidence to the criminal charge. If either the evidence or the argument fails, conviction is not possible. War is a different sort of system altogether. When George W. Bush said he was going to respond to the events of 9/11 with war, he was signaling that the process of seeking and evaluating evidence appropriate to the legal system would not be in operation. As for the tribunals proposed by the executive, they were to be designed and established by the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. In accordance with this, were subordinated to the war system and lacked the truth-finding obligations of a legal proceeding. Charles Siegel, in a submission on behalf of the Human Rights Committee of the American branch of the International Law Association, wrote the following, quote, every single constitutional guarantee intended to prevent the conviction and punishment of the innocent is deliberately sacrificed in the design of the commissions. There is no indictment by grand jury, no jury trial, no presumption of innocence, no privilege against self-incrimination, no public trial, no right to counsel of the defendant's choosing, no right to confront the evidence against one, no right to trial by an independent and impartial judge, no right to be convicted only by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Conviction and death sentence may be imposed by 2/3 of the hand-picked commission members. There is no appeal. There are no rules of evidence. Critics of the proposed tribunals who made submissions to the Senate hearing appear to have been mystified. Why use a process that was so flawed in its ability to discover the truth that was almost certain to convict the wrong people? To discover the truth that it was almost certain to convict the wrong people. Not only would innocent people languish in prison, but the guilty would remain at large, free to plan further acts of violence against the United States. There were some in the aftermath of the 9/11 events who understood that the process of truth-seeking was in peril. 2 days after the attacks, Francis Boyle, of international law at the University of Illinois, who was interviewed on Fox News Channel by Bill O'Reilly, refusing to endorse a war in Afghanistan, Boyle said, quote, we have to look at this very rationally. This is a democracy. We have a right to see what the evidence is and proceed in a very slow and deliberate manner, unquote. O'Reilly replied, quote, no, we don't. We do not. As a republic, we don't have the right to see what the evidence is if the evidence is of a national security situation, unquote. Boyle was insistent. Before he would endorse a war with anyone, he said, quote, I want to see the evidence that we are relying on to justify this. So far, I do not see it. I see allegations, I see innuendo, I see winks, and I see nods, but I do not see the evidence that you need under international law and the United States Constitution so far to go to war. Maybe that evidence will be there, but it is not there now. Boyle was prepared to speak of the possibility of war, but only if war was constrained by and understood within the framework of law. For this, he received not just O'Reilly's denunciation, but hate mail and a public repudiation by the dean of his law school. Clearly, law was out and war was in. The U.S. executive did not hesitate to seize the opportunity. And that's the end of chapter 3 of this book. So, yeah, just some detail that I think bolsters what Mark has been saying about the anthrax attacks themselves being an attack upon our civil liberties. The other chapters of this book are very much worth reading. I'm not sure if I might want to get back and read number 1 and 2 to you, because the details of the attack are not known to everybody, and there's a pretty succinct timeline that he gives in the book. Or get yourself a copy of it. It's the 2001 Anthrax Deception: The Case for Domestic Conspiracy by Graeme MacQueen. All right, guys, thanks for being with me this morning, and I will see you tomorrow morning, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, with the great Harley Schlanger. So that'll be a great show. I look forward to it, and I hope you do too. Sign up for my Rumble channel if you don't mind, and thanks very much for those that can support us a little bit on Patreon. You'll find the Patreon button at screamingospreys.com along with our calendar.